now there's a big market because it's cheaper than coal. Let's make one of these every day on a production line, just as Boeing does. What would happen? Well, we could replace all the coal power in the world in about 40 years and emit no CO2 at the end of that. Suppose we solve that problem. Let's attack the other problem, and that is petroleum is an equally big source of CO2 emissions, and it's very important for transportation. So let's approach that problem. One thing is that with a high temperature liquid fluoride thorium reactor, it becomes more efficient to separate hydrogen and oxygen from water. And so we've got a good opportunity to create hydrogen as a fuel. And there are hydrogen cars that are available in the market today, Honda Clarity being one of them. Fuel cell, electric drive, pressurized tank with compressed hydrogen. But rather than having that pressurized hydrogen, we might like to use more familiar liquid fuels. So for example, methanol is a good example. It's a good substitute for gasoline. George Olah got the Nobel Prize for doing the carbon chemistry associated with that and wrote the book about the methanol economy, replacing that with, again, a lifter making hydrogen in a CO2-free manner. We can perhaps create the methanol, or the dimethyl ether to replace diesel, or ammonia, which is both a fertilizer and it's also a fuel. Can be, in fact, here's an ammonia-fueled car that was touring Europe last year. I did the calculation figuring the cost that we might be able to make ammonia at, and we got about 19 miles per dollar on that sort of a car. So ammonia is a reasonable vehicle fuel. If we want to make the carbonaceous fuels that we're also familiar with and we have such a good infrastructure for, we need the carbon. And where are we going to get it in a carbon neutral way? We have to find a source that's something other than petroleum or coal, because we don't want to keep depositing the carbon back in the atmosphere. One way might be to capture CO2 directly out of the air, and proposals have been made to do that. They're all sort of marginal in terms of cost. It's expensive to do it that way. Might work. We might be able to do it with such a cheap energy source as a lifter. It's possible. Another way to do it is what the Navy discovered and has been working on very successfully, and that is to notice that there's a lot of CO2 dissolved in seawater. It's much easier to extract the CO2 from the seawater than from the air, and the air is always dissolving its CO2 into the ocean anyway. So they put together that particular unit in order to do that. It generated the hydrogen from the water, and it extracted the CO2 and created jet fuel. The Navy, of course, has a lot of experience with nuclear power on its ships, and so the Navy is looking at a shipborne, seawater-sourced jet fuel production plant that uses nuclear power, not the lifter specifically, but it could, to generate that jet fuel. And in this little example, they flew a very small airplane with it, just as a demonstration. $5 a gallon, that's okay. Could be cheaper, but that's not too bad. Now, the other kind of source of hydrogen could be biomass. We can get that from farming, creating coal or switchgrass or something. And we get about 3 tons of that per acre per year. But the approach here would be not to burn it for its energy content, but we want that for its carbon content. We want to add hydrogen to it and in a reactor of some sort, a chemical reactor, and create that kind of fuel. The other sources are things like cow dung, which is used in India as a fuel. It's, in a sense, relatively expensive because there's a lot of labor to go around and pick it up and make it into fuel. But I point out we actually have a dung collection system in most of our cities that we could use to get some of that carbon we need for biocarbon sources. There's a lot of research going on. Czech Republic's been doing tests. They have some salts left over from the Oak Ridge experiments. They're doing corrosion tests. France has the most famous group of people, really, who've been working on designs for these reactors. But again, all these projects are all university projects or national laboratory projects to advance the science. None of these outfits are really trying to build a thorium or liquid fuel reactor at this time. Not yet. But there's some research still going on. China is most aggressive on this. They have a project that was initially funded for about $350 million. That's Zhang Mianheng, who got the funding and the authorization, and Xu Hongzi, who's the guy in charge of the project, and me. Okay, so their objective is a molten salt reactor with thorium by 2020. Certainly not the two-fluid version, a single fluid version of some sort. Here's a slide from Zhang's talk, trying to explain that another driver for China is not so much the CO2 reduction, but the pollution reduction. So that's part of their investment. Meanwhile, there are several commercial ventures. One that I'm somewhat associated with, a denatured molten salt reactor-like, one that has both thorium and uranium as fuel, with a mass production technology more like a shipyard than an airplane factory. There's a company in Alabama by a guy, Kirk Sorensen, who was one of the sparks that got this project going again. There's an outfit in Boston, an MIT, I'm sorry, this one is in the Toronto area, by a guy who's thinking about perhaps trying to sell this to the people who are extracting petroleum from oil sands. Transatomic power at MIT, some people there. Even TerraPower, which is famous for its so-called traveling wave reactor, which is a liquid sodium-cooled reactor, is hedging its bets and has another project that looks at other alternatives, such as the molten salt reactor. We can't do this in the U.S. Right today, our regulatory structure is so restrictive that getting the permits to actually build and test one of these things would probably take the rest of this century. We have two regulatory bodies, the Environmental Protection Agency and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. It's unlikely that this is going to get done in the U.S. in the near future. So here we are in Taiwan. We have no coal, no oil, no gas. We have an aging nuclear fleet. The early ones are going to be up for renewal. We have people who are afraid of radiation, so one of the reactors is shut down and won't be started up. We have the opportunity for a new kind of power plant that has less waste, generates no CO2, and has more intrinsic safety features that makes it more walk-away safe. You have local thorium. You have an industrial tradition and capability from your shipyards. And if we just look at the marketplace for electric power plants over the next 30 years, the capital that's going to be expended is on the order of $5 trillion. So my recommendation would be that China that Taiwan not simply look at its own needs for nuclear power, but also look at the opportunity to become a world-class site for producing modular nuclear power plants of this liquid fluoride thorium variety and exporting them to the world market. Thank you.